As we continue our series on trying to get some history of early Brevard County, last week we had with us Bob Hudson from Titusville, who spent his life in Brevard County in the newspaper business. And I'm going to ask Joe Wickham to introduce a gentleman who has been here probably longer than anybody in Brevard County at this point, with his family and himself. Joe, if you would introduce our guest for today and tell us a little about his background.
I'm delighted to present the gentleman that we're going to talk about today and with, because his family was one of the original settlers in Brevard County and came here right after the Civil War, and he has been here his entire life, and we're delighted to have him with us today. And this is Mr. Lansing Gleason. Many of you have heard that name of the Gleason family, and this is a gentleman that has been here longer than any of the other Gleason members today. And I'm delighted, Lansing, to have you with us today, and we're looking forward to a very fine visit. And first of all, we'd like to ask you if you'd please tell us how your family came here in the beginning and where they came from and how they came not only to Brevard County, but how they got here from in the early days.
Well, in the beginning, my grandfather, William H. Gleason, lived in Baltimore at the end of the Civil War, and the War Department had a project on to take one of the southern states and put just Negroes in it. And they sent him as a commissioner to go over to Florida and make a report on Florida, which he did. And in doing that, he went all over the state, every way he could travel, horseback, boats, every way. He covered the whole state and got acquainted with a lot of people. And he reported adverse to putting the Negroes in Florida. He said it would ruin all the white people that were here, and he was opposed to doing it. With that, they disregarded the project, and in doing that, he went all over the state, as I say, and he was very much taken with the state, so much that he decided to move here. So he made this trip around the state in 1865. In 1866, he chartered a schooner at Hampton Roads and brought everything with him to move the family to Florida. The boat had everything from chickens to mules to pigs and everything else they might need, farming implements. And he and several other people, his mother, his partner, Mr. W.H. Hunt, and his wife, and they came first to Miami. He chartered the schooner to bring everything to Florida with him. And they arrived at Miami on July 16, 1866. They leased the Fort Dallas from the government and occupied it. As soon as they got to Cape Florida, the schooner couldn't get any farther up than Cape Florida, where the lighthouse is. So they came ashore in small boats. And my grandmother used to tell me about their first night at Fort Dallas. Of course, the fort had been abandoned then, and had been used during the Civil War, during the Seminole Indian War, and it had been abandoned, and it was just a pile of junk, really. But my grandmother tells about the first night they spent there, that they brought mattresses along to sleep on the floor, and they had quite a night of it, with the panthers howling and all the wildlife around Miami, and they had brought some dogs with them, and the dogs were afraid of the panthers, and they begged to get in the house. So they brought them in the house so the panthers wouldn't eat them. And that was their first night at Fort Dallas. And they cleaned it up and made it livable. And
Did they come on up from there then? Is that what they done at the?
well, before that though, they started a farm there, and they moved from Fort Dallas up to a place north of there, a little town north of there. It's extinct now, but they had a farm there, and they farmed there for several years. They were friendly with the Indians. The Indians were very, very nice to them, brought in deer and turkey and other things for them, and were very friendly. And but they were the third white settlers in Miami at that time. There were two other families there, one south of the river and one north of the river. And they stayed there several years, but the mosquitoes were so bad, life just wasn't good there. And Grandmother Gleason was a postmaster at this place where they moved to, Biscayne, I think it was called. Mm-hmm. She was the first postmaster there. And well, about 1882, grandfather had bought a piece of land up here at Eau Gallie, 16,000 acres from the state, for which he paid $1.25 an acre. And the state was anxious to sell land. They wanted settlers in the country to pay taxes and build it up. So he bought this 16,000 acres here. He also was a lawyer, and he, as a fee for quiet title to some of these land grants, he took a share of the land grant from the people that claimed it. And he did that at Titusville first, and he also did it at Jupiter and probably some other places. He had a law office in Jacksonville, and worked from there to Miami, and did this work while he was doing that. But the living wasn't good there with the mosquitoes, and the only people that came down there were refugees from jail or bad people. And they had this land up here, so they decided to come up to Eau Gallie and go to make a home here, which they did. And in 1883, they moved up to Eau Gallie. Prior to that, the state had formed the first agricultural college, and they agreed to build it at Eau Gallie, for which he gave them 2,000 acres of this land. And they built the original college building in Eau Gallie on Durant Street, and they came up there to open that as a hotel, and it was the first hotel in Eau Gallie. Eau Gallie was a rather popular place there because the hunting was so good and the fishing was so good. People came from all over. Some of them not too desirable, but they came anyway. One British group of hunters claimed that they killed 164 deer in one day hunting in the backwoods here. and but the fishing was very good. The rivers were clear, and ask me something.
Well, and when you come up there and you had all the fishing and everything else, were there any other settlers in the area of Eau Gallie at that time?
The first ones here was the Houston family, which came in this area in 1859, and they settled out at Bovine and brought their cattle with them. And during the night they were first here, panthers killed some of the cows, and so they took care of that, and they moved to Eau Gallie in 1859, and they were the first settlers in Eau Gallie.
Did they come down the St. Johns River?
Yeah, they came, people in those days went by the government surveys. They followed the surveys that were available at that time, which showed the way to go to get across the river and to get to where they wanted to go. And of course the survey was made in 1844, so
right.
They were available then, and they were very useful. People traveled that way. I think they crossed the St. Johns River somewhere up near Titusville and came on down to Eau Gallie from there.
Lansing, when did Eau Gallie start to grow? You mentioned some of the early settlers. What year did, they start thinking about an incorporation of a city or high schools or? Well,
in those days, they took the schools to the children. They didn't have central schools. They took, like Bovine had a school, Aurora had a school, Eau Gallie had a school. If they only had 4 or 5 students, well, they had a school. So the schools went to the people, went to the students.
Was there a doctor in the area back in the days that you're talking about?
No, there was no doctor here in those early days. I think Dr. Peake was the first one that came, and he probably came about the time of the railroad boom, which came to Eau Gallie in 1893. And when Dr. Creel came in 1910, he moved on to Fort Pierce. But he was the first doctor here. Prior to that, there was no doctors. My father had a medical book that gave all the information that they knew available at that time for different ailments. And he'd read the book and see what was wrong and took care of it. Everybody did that way. Children were born with midwives. About 1893, the railroad came in, and this was the terminus at Eau Gallie for about 2 or 3 years.
Would you explain where the railroad used to go before is where it is today?
Yeah. This is Deepwater at Eau Gallie was a favorable place for a dock, and the railroad built a railroad dock out in the Indian River, and the tracks went out on the river, on the bridge on the river, and they had a warehouse there too. If a train came and there was no boat in there at the time, they stored the goods in the warehouse, or if a boat was in, they transferred the goods straight to the steamer. And the steamer went from here down to Jupiter, and then from there they had a short railroad to south of Jupiter. It went to Bay Biscayne, and
the railroad as you see it today was, did not your father have something to do with putting it where it is today? And
they wanted it where it was. They chose the place because of the deep water in the river, and the station was down near, on shore near the river, and they had this warehouse out on the dock, of course.
And your dad owned the property at that time, didn't he?
He owned a lot of it here,
Yeah,
16,000 acres.
That's what I mean. The railroad had to deal with him to,
Yeah, well, he gave him 2,000 lots and 2,000 acres, I guess it was, as an inducement to come in. And
Wasn't it in the early 30s when they moved the railroad to where it is today from down Guava and moved it out to where it is today?
yeah, they moved, when the railroad went on south, they didn't need the dock with the warehouse on the river, so they moved up to Guava Avenue at what was then 6th Street, I believe.
That's right.
And it was there for several years, and it was a good station because of the large amount of fish that were caught and shipped up to Georgia. They were packed out in ice in barrels, and about from 100 to 200 barrels a day went out from Eau Gallie, from the station. Then during the first Florida boom, the railroad had a bad curve in it because of the Y they had when the dock was down on the river, and they had a lot of accidents there, so they moved it west of Guava Avenue out to Avocado Avenue, where it is now.
Right.
Joe, you had mentioned about a state university or something.
Well, that's what he was talking about. Now, that state university building that he's talking about is just about, wasn't it, Lansing, just about at the end of what is now known as Aurora Road, where
Well,
the
a little south of there.
where it hit the river.
Yeah, it was built on the river and was a nice building built with coquina rock, and it was ideal for hotel use after he bought it from the state.
Was it agricultural?
Agricultural college, I guess it was the first college that the state had.
That was before the University of Florida?
Oh, yes. Later it was moved to Lake City. Of course, grandfather was a Republican, so when the Democrats got control in 1876 or so, they moved it to Lake City.
and that's where the University of Florida was born, so it probably turned into the University of Florida in Lake City.
No.
No?
It was in Lake City just a short time, and then they moved it to Gainesville.
Well,
That's what he's talking about.
Yeah.
That's where the,
yeah, that's what I mean. Now it's the University of Florida.
Yes, right.
But originally it was in Eau Gallie.
yes. But it never opened here. They built the building, but it never opened.
You mentioned a while ago also the fact that you attended Kentucky Military Institute that was in Melbourne. That's another quite, as proud as we are today of FIT and BCC, we have a long history of being in the college business.
Yeah. After the railroad came in, some people built several cottages on this land south of the Eau Gallie River, west of where US 1 is now. I mean, west of the railroad. They built cottages there, but that, for some reason, it failed, and Colonel Fowler bought the project from the owners and moved the KMI school, Kentucky Military Institute, moved the school to Eau Gallie in the wintertime. They came in January and went back in May to Kentucky. He started that in 1907, and there were 2 fires that students are accused of starting. And then, anyway, most of the school burned down in the last one, and it was replaced by a 2-story building.
But it wasn't it didn't last well, it lasted up into the 20s, didn't it?
Yes, it did. It lasted quite some time.
He bought it in 1907, and in 1922, he didn't come to Florida anymore. It was bad times then. So he sold the school to a man named Sells, I believe.
Yeah, Colonel Sells.
And then it changed hands 2 or 3 times and finally closed up. But it was here till 1922. I think now they come to Venice.
You were speaking of the loading stuff from the end of the railroad on the dock and going down to Jupiter and so forth. That was before the day of the haulover canal to open up the intercoastal waterway, was it not?
I don't know just when the haulover canal was dug, but it must have been about that time. They moved it further north, as you know.
Oh, yes, I know where the original one was started
Yeah.
with Indian slave labor,
Yeah,
but it never was finished and opened. It sort of died for the lack of
Yeah.
Indians.
well, they did haul boats across there to get from the Halifax River to the Indian River. And
But it was an overland.
Yes.
It was really a haul over, and that's how it got
that's
its
right.
name.
Yes, that's right.
I can remember when I was just a young person on Merritt Island, the White Swan and another 1 or 2 freight boats used to come down from Jacksonville, down the intercoastal waterway. And there on Merritt Island, we had our own packing house and shipped, the community did, and shipped all of the citrus from that area, or most of it, on by those river steamers, paddle wheelers, to Jacksonville, and then it was put on a large outside ship and went to New York.
Yeah.
Could you tell us something about the pineapple plantations had over on the beach area in the early days?
Well, when the railroad came in here, they contemplated crossing the river at Eau Gallie to get to the freight from these pineapple plantations, which extended on Merritt Island and on down south of the Atlantic, several hundred acres of them.
There were a lot of pineapples on further down around Fort Pierce too,
Yes.
were there not?
Yeah.
Did they have a blight or something that killed them
Yes,
off, or what?
I guess it was nematodes maybe got into them, and further they took the tariff off pineapples, and they came in from Cuba, which terminated the pineapple
see.
industry here.
That's interesting.
That went, as I have heard the story, when Flagler finally got his railroad all the way to Key West, he would haul Cuban pineapples to Jacksonville cheaper than he would Brevard County and St. Lucie County pineapples to Jacksonville, because he was so anxious to have some sort of a return cargo from Key West
Yeah.
that he gave them a special price, and that sort of finished putting us out of the pineapple business.
Yeah, that ended it.
Well, we did get back into the tomato business over there. You ought to be able to tell us something about the tomatoes. You know, that was the one spot that they wouldn't freeze in this country in the early
Yeah.
days.
That was on the peninsula, as we called it then.
That's right.
Opposite Eau Gallie. There were savannas through the land there that were very rich in soil, and we had some farmers come up from Dade County that farmed it for a couple of years, but when the Florida fruit fly came in, they wouldn't let us ship tomatoes across the river, and they said we had to bury them under 10 feet of dirt or something like that. So that terminated the tomato business. But it's interesting to note that the tomato farmers didn't have much of an organization then, but the citrus people, they wanted to cut all the citrus trees too, and all the guava trees, and they had enough political power to stop that.
They were trying to cut them all on Merritt Island and the peninsula.
Yeah.
Wouldn't that have been something if they'd wiped out all of the oranges and?
I worked for the government that one summer when I was in high school on that fruit fly eradication program, and we went all over Merritt Island with little knapsack sprayers on our back, spraying citrus and anything else that might have fruit on it.
Yeah.
And the spray was a mixture of brown sugar, arsenic, and water.
Well,
And that brown sugar would make it stick on and also make the flies come and eat it. And that, we'll never know whether that had anything to do with eradicating them or not.
I think one of the most interesting things about that, and Lansing, did you ever see a fruit fly out in any grove or anything else? The only one I ever saw, they had between two pieces of plastic or something that they'd ironed in there so that I could show people what it looked like. But in the field, no one ever saw one. But it was a great program.
Well, there weren't really very many of them here, I don't think. And I think we probably did the right thing to jump in, as we did down in Miami here recently, jump in and do some spraying and not take any chances of them spreading, because they could have wiped us out. The same thing with this canker situation we have now. If they just disregard it and let it go, we'd be out of the citrus business, I think, in 5 years' time completely. But I'm proud of them for paying attention and doing something about it.
Well, when the Crane Creek Drainage District and the Melbourne-Timmins Drainage District became a part of the area, did that really do the kind of a job that they felt it would do to drain this area and get it into condition where they could utilize it?
yes, it did. Of course, the back country was pretty wet then, and that drainage really made it livable, and it was a good thing.
Did that old gentleman, Mr. Hopkins, did he not continue the Eau Gallie River on out toward Lake Washington in the early days?
Yes, he did.
What did he do that with?
He did it with mules and
Slip pans?
slip pans. And
Just like pan.
Yeah, slip pan, your man stands behind it and they skid it along. And
Looks like a wheelbarrow without a wheel.
I'm just saying, these things are interesting.
And I can't believe they'd move that much earth with that sort of thing.
Well,
he got it pretty well underway, which is called Hopkins Ditch now.
yeah.
But the Jacksonville Chamber of Commerce brought a suit against him, contending that draining Lake Washington into the Indian River would lower the water level at Jacksonville, and so ships couldn't use the channel there. So they prevailed on that, so he never got to Lake Washington with it. But he did get several miles of it.
Didn't they find one place that had a lot of fossils out there?
Yes, there was a place where they found elephant tusks and all kinds of fossils of those ancient animals.
Did this with a slip pan. Can't you imagine driving mules
No.
up through that?
No,
Well-
not back in there where they had, I'm sure there were mosquitoes in there also.
Oh,
Had a lot of mosquitoes, but they probably had a lot of mules and a lot of slip pans, you know.
But that was out the old Hernandez Trail. Now, you remember where that was, do you? The Spanish Trail that came up through there where the original settlers used to walk. Wasn't it somewhere near Turtle Mound Road
Yeah,
where it is today?
That's where Turtle Mound is now. Mountain Road is now. That was the high ground between
Isn't that interesting?
St. John's River and Lake Washington and the Indian River.
That was the high ground?
And they would walk all along there, wouldn't they? The old Spanish Trail, and because that was the one spot they could walk up and down here in normal weather
Yeah, with
without
no,
having to ford
no-
streams and everything else.
no
Isn't that
bridges to
interesting?
cross. That was used by I guess the Indians used it first, and then during the Indian Wars, the Army used it to spy things for the Army. So it was a pretty well-marked trail.
Lansing, you were an attorney, is that correct?
You know,
And what year did you open your office here?
I never opened an office. I took it for the real estate business.
All right, so you in the real estate business all your life?
Yeah.
And you had some brothers here?
No, I had two sisters.
Okay,
Cousins. He had cousins.
all right. Because I've heard of the Gleason, a lot of Gleasons in South Brevard.
Yeah, you had the Gleason brothers and George and Ivan, wasn't it?
Yeah.
They were cousins, were they not? First
Yeah.
cousins?
Well, first it was George and my father, or Gleason Brothers originally.
That's
That
right.
was organized in 1899 and still exists today.
It did. Was it your father who laid out the old city of Eau Gallie?
Yes.
He laid out the
My grandfather.
grandfather. Isn't that interesting? And what it is today. And see, they had the little village plat there in the beginning, which is down around the creek. And
What year was that planted, Joe?
1893.
isn't that interesting?
It's a long way.
And then the whole community has expanded from that original development.
But was Eau Gallie here before Melbourne?
Well, there was a time they were both about the same size, and
Did they start about the same time?
just about the same
Yeah.
time, wasn't it?
Yeah.
My father came to Merritt Island in 1885, and quite a bit after that, he and Dr. Hill, and Mr. Reed, and Mr. Bruin had the Brevard County Telephone Company. Do you remember that?
Oh, yes. Yeah.
And the telephone company ran from New Smyrna to Jensen Beach,
Yeah.
and they only had a few telephone poles. They had wires nailed up on trees. And it was, but it got the job done for back in those days.
An interesting thing happened about, let's see, about 1879 or so. This article was written by somebody that knew about it at the time. And my father had business in Miami, he had land there. And they never went in a boat by themselves, and there was nobody else to go. So he walked to Miami on the beach and walked down and back. There's no other way to get there except by boat. And there wasn't any boat to go, so he walked it, swimming across the inlets.
Those people back in those days really wanted to go someplace.
There
didn't
wasn't
they?
too many Holiday Inns back then, were there?
Isn't that remarkable? That's the days of the barefoot mailman, wasn't it?
Before that,
Yeah.
My dad somebody was trying to talk him into going to Miami and investing in a little property back in the, I guess, 90s, so to speak. And Dad said, how would we go down, and how long would it take? And this Dr. Grambling said, well, Claire, we'll go down in our sailboat as far as Jupiter, and Jupiter we can catch on with a boat going outside into Miami. And say we stay there a couple of weeks, we can be back in 3 months.
All right. Those were interesting days, and most people don't realize that we had turpentine stills and all those sort of things in our area, didn't we?
Yeah. The
Sawmills.
Sawmills and turpentine stills, and of course the fishing was the basis for Eau Gallie in the early years.
Well, you'd mentioned that the rivers used to be very clear. Were they like some of our clear, like Crystal River now, where could you see the bottom?
Yeah, you could see the bottom most of the time. Of course, with a northeast wind, you wouldn't, but a normal southeast wind in the summertime, it was clear and the bottom was not cluttered up with stuff like it is now.
One of the things that I marvel at a lot is when I was a kid growing up in the river a whole lot, up in the Merritt Island Cocoa area, we had no clams whatsoever. I know there were some down in the Sebastian and from Sebastian south, but we had absolutely no clams, and now the river bottom's, so to speak, covered with them up there. Do you remember it that same way?
I don't remember there being any clams here then.
That's what I'm
And
talking about.
I don't remember shrimp being here like they are now. I think opening the Sebastian Inlet probably brought the shrimp in.
I think so. I think, and also the fact that all over Canal is open, and there's a inlet at New Smyrna, makes a somewhat of a circulation there that they can come and go either way.
Yeah.
But I just, it amazes me to see how many clams they bring in from the Indian River now.
Yeah.
And back in those days when the river was theoretically much, much cleaner, but we didn't have any clams.
And you remember how now they talk about the fluorescent lights that we had in
Oh,
the
the
river.
phosphorus?
And phosphorus, and there's too much of it in the river and all. I can remember when on a dark night, it looked like one great candle in the entire river. Haven't you seen it like that?
Just like it was on fire.
Like
Yeah.
it was on fire, and you could see every fish that swam and every crab and everything else.
I've not heard any explanation as to where the phosphorus went. Have you?
Well, I think the pollution killed it.
Do you really?
Yeah.
But in those days, everyone in the community that lived here in the summertime would end up basically at night walking out on the bridges. Do you remember Lansing? Just to see the phosphorus, and it was a sight to see.
Well, when you went out with a boat, the commotion the boat made would
And the wake and everything.
light it up, and you could see the fish darting away.
A real professional fisherman could tell you what kind of a fish it was by the length of the fire from the phosphorus.
Yeah.
But you know, interesting to me is that back in those days it was very, very fiery in the Indian River and Banana River, but it also was in the ocean, and it's gone there too now. I can't believe it's only the pollution. Seems to me something else happened.
I don't know what it would be, but certainly the pollution killed it in the Indian River.
But you know as well as I do that all of our little communities begin to dump all their sewage into each one of the into the tributaries and that sort of thing. And I remember when even in our own community, Lansing, when they put on a drive to eliminate any septic tanks from going into the river. Do you remember that? Way back, that was 50, 60 years ago.
Yeah.
Trying to clean things up, and after they agreed that no one who had a septic tank would run his water or effluent into the river, and then the municipalities began to dump it out in just great quantities in
Yeah.
there. Now we're going through a transition period to eliminate that.
Yeah, I think one of the other pollutants that's done a lot of damage to the river is oil and gasoline coming off of the roads. Every car that goes down the road leaves a little bit of residue, a few drops of oil here and a little overfill of gasoline there, and all of that on that pavement. It has been over the last 50 years geared to run off and run to the river. Now they're trying to put settlement ponds and all of this to keep it from doing that. But I think those products have done a lot of damage.
I think one of the interesting things that's happened to us, and you were here, and I remember when I was a young fellow that all the tourists, if you could keep them here in the May, they had accomplished many things because the mosquitoes were so bad. You remember the drives they used to have to stay through May?
Yeah.
And
Everybody left that could.
and that's right, you could shoot a cannon down the middle of the road and never hit a soul.
They used to have smudge pots in front of businesses, didn't
Oh,
they?
everybody, that was part of their home life, wasn't it, Lansing?
Yeah.
Everybody had a screen door on their house, and everybody had a mosquito brush made out of a finely sliced palmetto fan
Home.com, yeah.
tied to their screen door, and you better brush yourself off before you went in or you weren't very welcome.
And if you had the privilege of having an outdoor toilet someplace, that was part of the fixtures, wasn't it?
Oh, yes.
When the Navy came in during the war, they annihilated the mosquitoes with this spray that they used, and that really made it livable in Florida. Florida really began to grow then because people realized they could stay here in the summertime.
Joe,
Well,
talking about those outside privies, the first school that I went to on Merritt Island was, as Lansing mentioned, they brought the school to us. There was just one room, one teacher, and I don't remember how many grades there were of us, but several. And it had two outside privies, and one for the girls and one for the boys. And they were about 100 feet apart, out about 100 feet out back of the school. And that was all the plumbing we had.
In the early days, I remember right after the boom in of the 20s, you remember when Loveridge Heights was formed, and they put a 6-inch main, a water main from the mainland at the end of Houston Street, crossed over to this. In those days, you only paid $2 or $3 for unlimited quantities of water, and those people were fixing their lawns over there and had the sprinklers going. And up at the Creel School, which is the old Creel School on Pineapple Avenue, if you wanted to turn a faucet on or something, all you could do is just have air sucking through there because they were running the water through so fast. Do you remember that, Lance? We had to pass an ordinance to prohibit them using all of that water over there so the children could go to school.
Put meters on.
Isn't that, you remember that?
Yeah.
It's quite unique, and that shows you the times and what's changed in our community since.
The original system, you had no meters, you just paid and used.
Lump sum, you know, and they knew that, and for a couple dollars, $2, $3, you could end up, and some of them would use up to 100,000 gallons a month, you know, and the original system, remember, to get water up on top of the tank was that old Fram system that they used to have.
Yeah, we had a what's the name of the man down at
Couch.
Couch?
Yeah.
Couch well. It was a 12-inch well which the city had, and the well furnished the power to pump water up in the tank as well as use
They
some of the
couldn't
water.
they couldn't afford electricity, so they designed this thing. Lansing was involved in that. That's the reason I brought it up. And my father, you remember how they developed that Fram system, and the water coming out of that well would force its own water about 125 feet up in the air to the top of the water tank, and that was the way they got it up there, didn't they?
Yeah.
You could hear that thing beating all over town at night.
The well had a lot of pressure, didn't it?
And when you got it, that's right, that Fram system would pump enough water by the flow of that well to force it clear to the top of that water tank. And then when you had it 125 feet up in there, then you had about 45 or 50 pounds of pressure on the hydrants, you know.
That Fram system
isn't
worked
that
sort of,
interesting?
it was a hydraulic type principle.
Right.
A little bit of water exerting 10 pounds pressure on a bigger amount of water gets the same result.
And they pumped it for years. They went through that process. Isn't that interesting?
The insurance companies investigated Eau Gallie because of that system. And they said that was the nearest thing they ever saw to perpetual motion.
Yeah.
So they give us a good rate.
I remember that. I thought that was unique. But these are the things that help make our community tick in the south end of Brevard County, and I know that people like Lansing, who was here to see the great majority of this happen to us, have been most pleased because, as an example, the main route used to be for those people who come down the St. Johns River to get off at Turtle Mound, the little island of Turtle Mound, and migrate all the way into town through that area which he called Bovine and on into town. And what did they do? They used to either walk or come in by buggy or horse.
Most everybody had a horse or a mule, so they had transportation.
Yeah, that was the way they came to town, and isn't that interesting? We had, and I remember it out back of Eau Gallie, we had 3 Japanese families there. Do you remember?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And they were in the produce business and did an outstanding job in our community. And some of them are still in Florida.
Are they?
One is a doctor up in Lake City, and some of them are in legal positions down around Miami, and one is, I think, the agricultural agent down in the Pahokee area or someplace like that. And some others are raising tomatoes and that sort of thing up near Savannah. So they've been a great organization.
They used to bring their produce up to Cocoa and so forth. I remember them quite well.
And my sister was talking only the other day that she ran into someone who knew little Mary Hirado, who was the older one of those girls, and haven't seen her for maybe 40 or 50 years, and they started corresponding together. Isn't that interesting?
Yeah.
She's over in the West Coast.
Lansing, I think of something that I remember quite well, and I was pretty young when it happened. The Melbourne had a midway tourist camp.
Yeah.
And as I remember the story, the man that built it stopped in Cocoa and was basically run out of town. Nobody wanted those tin can tourists. And I can very well remember the tin can tourist, and I know you can.
Yeah.
That was a slogan somebody cooked up, and they
Well,
said
they brought all their vegetables and things with them.
they brought their food. They were farmers from up north, and they brought all their canned goods down to last them all winter, and they brought a tent to live in. They didn't spend much money. And so Cocoa just about said, get out of town, and they did build this Midway, wasn't it Midway?
It was a tremendous trailer park.
Big trailer park, and
It's still down there, part of it.
and I think that as it turned out, it was probably a great thing for Melbourne, because I know an awful lot of those people ended up being permanent citizens of South Brevard County. They came down as a tin can tourist, so to speak, but they turned into being good merchants and everything else in South Brevard. So it was quite a growing influence on the growth.
A interesting thing about during the war, the Japanese, one family went back to Japan just before the war started, and the rest stayed. Remember Ozaki's family?
That's right.
And he's a colonel now in the U.S. Army.
Yeah, that's right. The whole family joined all those that stayed here all joined the American services.
Even the girls.
Even the girls.
Yeah.
And they were real community people. That's right. One of them's a colonel, one's a doctor, and then they've all done it. They were a real asset to our community.
Yes, they were.
And they were in an area just about out where Wickham Road intercepts Aurora Road now.
Long about that same time, Merritt Island had 2 or 3 Italian families come in that were quite agricultural minded, and they're still, ancestors are still on Merritt Island, the Chrysopolis,
Is right.
and the Garofalo's and
What's it, Policiccio?
Policiccios.
In that boom of the early 20s, that's when we began to get fancy hotels up and down this East Coast. Of course, you had the big Indian River Hotel in Cocoa and the Brevard Hotel, which is up there. And in our own area, we had, was it called the Oleanders in the beginning? Lansing?
Yeah.
It's down on the end of the...
Harbor City.
Harbor City, I think it was
It
originally.
was built by a group of public-spirited citizens. Thought we need to have a hotel, so they built the Oleanders.
Lansing, back in, say, when you were 20 or 30 and were living here, what did you do for recreation, your family? And
Well, there was the river and the ocean. I guess we had tennis courts. We had some recreation.
Baseball was quite a thing in the
baseball
summertime to go to the baseball games and so on. I know Cocoa and Melbourne used to have some pretty hot ball games.
Eau Gallie and Sebastian had good games.
Every little community in those days, Cocoa was probably the biggest leader, but all these communities had their own ball teams. You remember, Lansing? Every one of them. They had some wonderful competition. And in those days is when we began to have night softball and all that sort of thing, you know. And every community began to move from the hardball to the lighted softball team area.
That basically put the town team type baseball out, because so many more people could participate in the softball.
But you know, when we talk about, for the series that we've had, this is like the 4th meeting of the early times, which you 3 people remember. I wasn't living here then. And in the short time that we've changed that much, what do you think is going to happen in another 40 years? With Florida supposed to be the 4th most populous state? And you wonder what's going to happen to all the things that you all talk about.
Well, I personally think, and I imagine Lansing feels a lot like I do, we haven't really seen any real growth yet, because the future with all of the people who want to come to Florida and all of the things that we're able to do here in this country now compared to what they can do some other places, the growth is going to be unbelievable. And with the space age, as it's going to move into the programs that they have, it's going to be very difficult for some of us old-timers 50 years from now to try to readjust, wouldn't it be?
Right.
Well, it would be hard for our parents to come back and
And
readjust
do what we've done.
what there is now. I think the only thing in the world that's constant is change. We're going to keep on changing gradually all the time.
But just think what a wonderful time in the world, in world history it's been to live in this time. Because 100 years ago, as an example, they had nothing but sailboats really to go, and then they invented steam and came the steam trains and the steam ships, and then we've had automobiles and airplanes and medicine and TVs and radios and all of these other things, and now we're into the space age. All of this has been done in the lifespan of we four fellows sitting here, and just think how lucky we are that we've been able to live in an era when more things have been accomplished in the entire history of civilization.
But then you wonder how we're going to take care of the populace with our water, our sewage disposal, utilities, or road networks, and we've got some big problems coming up.
That is correct.
Those things, I think, will fit into the change just like everything else. I'm naturally worried about gasoline, what's going to happen when gasoline gives out. But I'm sure that by the time it gives out, we'll have invented something to take its place.
I think today's, and it's just a matter of time till we've seen the last of those great big semis hauling tankers full of gas. I'm talking about in the next 25 years, there'll be some new concept. Like I read only a day or two ago where in Australia that the General Motors had developed that solar car that run 2,500 kilometers at 43 miles an hour, and I read this only in the last 2 or 3 days, and just think of that. And this thing was from the energy, sun cells generating the power for this automobile.
There'll be a solution,
Yeah.
and it won't happen until it's needed. You know, somebody asked me back quite a few years ago when we were having the gasoline shortage, well, why in the world hadn't somebody come up with a substitute for gasoline? I said, as long as gasoline, and it was then, had been for a number of years, selling for 29 cents a gallon. I said, as long as it's that cheap, why do you want a substitute? Nobody could make anything that they could afford for 29 cents.
But just think what Brother Lansing's been able to do in all of those years when he came into our community. And as he said, the mode of transportation was a sailboat on the river, and they thought that was the ultimate in those early days. And from that has been all this development in our community, and it's been good in many respects, and it has its shortcomings. But I know that with all of the connections you had and the areas in which you helped develop in Brevard County, and especially here in the South End, that it's been a revelation for you because he helped motivate all the things that made our community tick as it has in the past. And he won't tell you this, but without him, we would not have been able to have many of the things that we have here in the South End of Brevard County.
Speaking of recreation, to get to the beach, we had to go in a rowboat across the river and then follow a trail through the palmettos and all across these savannas to get to the beach. And it was quite an ordeal to go to the beach.
And who dedicated that little 16-foot strip that you're talking about to go to the beach in the early days that was in all the maps and plats? Do you know? Because you'd get on here you'd cross over to the east side of the river, then you walk down that little path all the way over to the beach. Do you remember that?
Yeah, I don't remember the 16 feet.
Well, it's still in there.
There was a path there.
It's still in there. Yeah, that's right. And all I can think of is how, and if you wanted to go over there for a picnic in those days, you carried with you, didn't you, Lansing?
Yeah, you carried everything with you.
And,
Well, we had to come down the Indian River and go around the point of Merritt Island and then back up to get to Oceanus,
Yeah.
which was south
that
of
was a nice
Cocoa.
little narrow spot. up there.
Oceanus was just about the north gate of Patrick Air Force Base now.
I know what I wanted to ask you today. we've been talking about all of this erosion and everything else on the beaches, and they've hauled all of this sand in, and they get all excited when it leaves again. What's your concept of what it's done in the past?
Well, it comes and goes. The ocean takes it away, and the ocean brings it back. So there's nothing to worry about. Just let it go.
And
But
Don't get all excited.
yeah, they haul all this sand down from Cape Canaveral up down to Melbourne Beach and in the Atlantic. It's ridiculous.
and the next year is all back to Cape Canaveral, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Well, it circulates.
Well, we have less than a minute, and I know you two gentlemen have known Lansing for a long time, but Lansing would really like to thank you for taking time out of your day and come over and helping make this recording that is going to be available to the public in years to come about the history of Brevard County. And certainly you've told us many things that I've never even heard of, and reminded these two younger fellows of some things that probably they didn't think about. So we really appreciate you being with us. Joe, do you have any?
No, it's been wonderful, because I've been a friend and known Lansing Gleason for many, many years, and I'm just delighted we had an opportunity to have him here today so we could get a real background of what happened in the beginning.
Dave?
I feel exactly as Joe said. I've known Lansing, really known of him as far back as I can remember, really, and known who he was and what a great job he was doing down here. I've heard people say, you know, well, he made a lot of money out of it. I said, yes, he did. But thank goodness there was somebody interested in making money and would do some of these things that would make everything else grow. You know, without somebody being motivated, nothing happens.
Yeah.
Well, Lansing, we thank you very much.
Okay, good to be with you.
That's one of the things that has always just annoyed me. Just like